Welcome to the Putting the Public into Health podcast by Dr. Richard Pan. As we face one of the greatest public health disasters in the century, this podcast will address questions and issues from you, the public, about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on people's health and lives. I am Dr. Richard Pan. I'm a physician with a background in public health, and I'm proud to represent the people of Sacramento, Elk Grove, West Sacramento, and parts of Sacramento County in the California State Senate. I want to share with you important information and stories to help each other during this difficult time. The novel coronavirus was first identified in humans only half a year ago, but as the virus has spread, so has new information and misinformation about the disease. Health reporters are busy sorting truth from fiction to report accurate information to the public. I am truly excited to have one of our nation's leading science and health journalists, Tara Haelle, join me. She is a Forbes contributor and the medical care topic leader for the Association of Healthcare Journalists. She has written several books, including co-authoring The Informed Parent, a science-based guide to the first 4 years. Thank you so much for joining me, Tara.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
So how did you decide to become a healthcare journalist?
That's a long story that I will make very short. I had gone back to grad school for journalism while I was, after I had been teaching high school, and I got married that first year, and I had my son the following year. And there was a confluence of events that happened. I didn't really have a specific focus that I was heading toward as a journalist, but a bunch of different things happened at once that sort of, when I look back, I think I was always on the path to become a health and science journalist and didn't know it. It started largely with my quest to learn information about vaccines because I had a new baby and I wanted to understand them, but I wanted to do it right. So I spoke to a wide range of people across the entire spectrum, from ultra anti-vaccine all the way until very, very pro-vaccine, and people who are parents and government officials. And that helped, that sort of launched my interest. But I was simultaneously learning about how to write about medical studies. And before long, that was just where I ended up. So it wasn't really a planned thing, but when I look back at the various events that happened along the way, it's clear that that's kind of where I belonged. And given that my mother is a registered nurse, I think it makes sense as well.
Wow. So now we have COVID-19. What are some of the biggest challenges about reporting on this pandemic?
I'd say there are two main challenges for reporters. One of them, and I think they're related as well. I think one of them is the cause or an underlying contributor to the other. The biggest issue is that this is a brand new virus. We knew nothing about it before it popped up. We know some things about past similar viruses such as SARS, but we still just don't have the information that we need in order to issue good public health recommendations. And that means that as we learn more information, recommendations change. And so I'd say the changing science is the hardest part because you're trying to communicate information to the public, and the public is not used to seeing the incremental, messy process of science. They're more used to seeing the end result or a midway or later result in science. And science is incredibly messy. It's not a straightforward linear line. It involves lots of different studies and comparing them and looking at the methods of those studies. And it's very incremental, and there are contradictions along the way. I think that a lot of people struggle with that kind of uncertainty and those shifts and contradictions because they're not used to the way that science operates on a day-to-day basis as opposed to a year-by-year basis. So as a journalist, I have to constantly stay up with what the most current research has found and put that into the context of what we had previously known and why it's changed, all without undermining the message that these people do know what they're doing. And the fact that it keeps changing is actually evidence of science working, not of science not working. That leads, however, to the other major problem, which is the huge amount of misinformation that's out there. I've heard people use the term, I think you've used it, infodemic. Because the information is changing on a regular basis, because that's how science works, the people who have trouble understanding that or have trouble grappling with the uncertainty or simply want answers now are seeking those answers wherever they can find them, regardless of whether they are scientifically supported. And that has given rise to a lot of beliefs in false information, in conspiracy theories, in neat and simple seeming answers that tie everything together but don't have scientific basis. So as a journalist, I'm on two fronts. I'm on the front of trying to help people understand the science while also trying to dissuade them from looking at what is not supported by science and help them understand why it's not supported by science. And I think all of this is complicated by the fact that we've had greater politicization of our public health community's recommendations than we ever have in the past. In the past, our federal government has always deferred to the CDC and experts, and that has not been the case in this particular instance, and I think that complicates things as well.
Well, in February, the World Health Organization reported that the infodemic, is termed, was as serious as the COVID-19 pandemic itself. And you spoke to the challenges of reporting when the science is continuing to evolve and we're learning more about the disease. How does a reader, the public, identify reliable sources of information when things are constantly shifting?
I think you have to pick out several sources that you know follow the science reliably. One way of doing that is to follow scientific publications, not publications rather, but news organizations that focus on science, such as Science News and Scientific American and Wired. Some of those are going to be having the most in-depth information. Other people may not want that level of depth, so I'd encourage them to look at a variety of sources that have been long established and have a history of communicating accurate information. And that could be your local newspaper. It can be several large major newspapers. I don't want to point to a specific newspaper because I don't want to imply that one is better than another. There are some that are better than others. But if you have a diverse diet, I think of my news diet like a literal health diet. You need a little bit of everything, the carbohydrates, the protein, the fat, and you can throw a little sugar in there if you want, but not too much. I think of blogs and opinion blogs rather, as sort of those are my donuts and my appetizers. I can't have too many of them. I can't make a meal of them. My protein, what I really get the meat of stuff from, needs to be from a variety of local newspapers, news stations if you prefer. I'm not as big a fan of news stations. I think that reading is better, a lot of online sites. If you have trouble reading or have a disability that makes it difficult to read, I encourage people to look for the podcasts of those sites. A lot of the online sites have podcasts that you can listen to instead of needing to read it, and you're going to get that quality information. And when you see a story, look for that story in 2 or 3 of those other sources and see if they match up. See where things are similar and where they match up, because that way okay, I have 3 or 4 different reliable sources. Reliable meaning they've been written by journalists who write about science on a regular basis and understand how to make sense of science and explain it to people. Then you can feel pretty firm and confident that information is the most current information we can get. I can't say that's the most correct information, because the whole idea of science is to get better and better at finding what's correct.
You talked about a variety of sources, but you didn't mention social media. And in fact, more people report getting their news from social media than from print newspapers. So how is social media platforming information and disinformation or misinformation or conspiracy theories about COVID-19?
Well, I have a confession that will probably surprise you and maybe a lot of your listeners. Okay. You ready for this?
Yes, I think.
I get most of my news from social media. So I am just like a large number of Americans who go to social media first when I'm looking for my news. Now, how I use that social media probably differs a lot. One thing is who you follow. I follow a large number of epidemiologists, infectious disease doctors, public health officials, academics. I follow a lot of other science journalists, so I see what my colleagues are writing and doing. And I'm not just looking at things they say, I'm looking at what they share. And what they're sharing are those same articles that I'm talking about. They're sharing the articles that are from established media organizations that have a track record in communicating accurate science. And then those are the articles I often start with. And then from there, I look at what questions I have, and then I Google search to answer that question, or I go to the homepage of that site and see what else they're reporting, or I look at their recommended stories, or you might also like stories. But a lot of times I start with what's on social media because the people that I follow science journalists, epidemiologists, other physicians, they are also reading the news, and I know that what they share is going to be high quality. So in a way, I'm helping use them to filter through the news. There's a lot of news every day, and there's no way to see all of it. It's just too much. So when you are careful about how you curate the people you follow, you can increase the likelihood that you're seeing the news that you need to see.
And also in terms of, I guess, retweeting or reposting things, we also need to remember to try not to retweet or repost things that we're not sure about, right? So we're not further propagating it.
You know, here's another confession. I have deleted more tweets in the last 3 months than in the entire previous 8 years I used Twitter. Why did I delete the tweets? Because I tweeted something or I retweeted something, and then I realized, or I looked around and found more information that was wrong, or in many cases, another person on Twitter corrected me or gave me new information. In some cases, I clarified it by retweeting that. In other times, what I said was wrong enough that I couldn't risk leaving what I had said up, and so I just deleted it altogether. And then I tweeted saying, I had a tweet mentioning X. I've deleted it because Y, and here's the link regarding that. So I think it's important to recognize that if you tweet something that's incorrect, it doesn't make you a bad person or stupid or anything like that. It means you're human and you're trying to sort through a mass of information in a time of uncertainty. But the problem is that there is so much false information and there are so many conspiracy theories on Twitter that if you allow yourself inadvertently to be pulled down into some of those rabbit holes, then you are pulling yourself away from the most accurate information. So when you see something that sounds too good to be true or sounds too neat or too simplistic, too like, oh, yes, that all fits together like a perfect puzzle. Well, reality is not perfect. So if it's fitting together like a perfect puzzle and all the pieces seem to fall into place, you should be looking at that with a lot of skepticism.
Now, you mentioned earlier that it seems that political leaders are the ones who are speaking mainly about the pandemic. So we've had, President Trump and state governors have essentially taken the podium from public health experts during this pandemic. How should the media report on health claims made by politicians? And should reporters demand that we hear directly from the public health leaders themselves?
That has been a huge challenge. I will say that journalists have been trying to demand to hear from the public health community themselves in terms of the CDC. The CDC is completely locked down to journalists. We can't get them to talk to us. So just so that your constituents know, we have tried. They are locked down because President Trump has determined that he wanted to have his task force take over that messaging. And that is the first time that has happened in the CDC's history, which was surprising and disappointing and frustrating for those of us who rely on the CDC for their information and their expertise. What we've done instead as reporters is reach out to public health experts at individual universities. So if a politician or other kind of policy leader without a public health background makes a statement, if that statement is getting a lot of attention, then as journalists, we have an obligation to address that statement because people are going to want to know if it's true or not or what evidence is behind it. That is when we turn to what the medical evidence says, if there are studies that say one thing or another, and if there aren't medical studies yet, then we contact people at major universities that have public health departments, and we rely on the experts at those places. They don't have any restrictions on their ability to speak about the science right now. And that way we can vet what public health, we can vet what policy leaders are saying and presidents and governors are saying against what the public health community is saying. It's simply not our public health community. It's our university and private public health community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Although, again, it's our government agencies like the CDC are the places that we gather the information from across the country and so forth. So it's certainly challenging when they are not allowed to speak out and share what they know and their expertise, because many of them have devoted their entire careers to preparing for pandemics like this one.
Absolutely. I've been at the CDC for a fellowship on reporting on health, and while I was there, it was during the Zika epidemic. And I went into, I guess, I don't know that it was called this, but the equivalent of the situation room, basically the ground zero at the CDC for managing the epidemic of Zika. And I saw all the computer monitors and all the monitors on the hanging on the wall that people were looking at, and people at their desks, and the meeting room. And I was blown away. It's a remarkable agency with procedures that have been fine-tuned over decades. They are the preeminent public health agency in the world, above the WHO. They have the largest budget of any public health agency in the world. To take the largest brain trust that we have related to the largest pandemic we faced in a century and not allow them to communicate to the public is a public health danger in and of itself.
Couldn't agree more. Now, many people look to a coronavirus vaccine as our salvation from the pandemic, but there's a lot of hype and news going around. Do you see that potential vaccines are being overhyped by investors?
I think there is some overhyping going on with investors. There's a lot of money to be made from a vaccine that will be given to 8 billion people, but there is also a lot of people who will need that vaccine who can't pay for that kind of vaccine. So that means we need to have a lot of public, private, and educational institution partnerships going on so that it's not something where it's a vaccine to make money on. There will also be productions of that vaccine when it comes, hopefully, that will lose money because they will be distributed to people in other countries that can't afford it. And I do worry a little about some of the investors that are hyping new technologies that we haven't had a successful vaccine from yet. But I also know that there are more than 100 different groups across the world working on vaccines. There are more than 10 different vaccines in trials already. And that gives me hope that approximately 1 in 8 or 9 trials makes it all the way through to FDA approval. So with 10 or so having already started, 10 or 12 already started, that gives me hope that there'll be at least one within, I think 18 months to 2 years is optimistic. I think we're probably not going to see it for 3 to 4 years. That's my own opinion. But I think we're going to end up with a couple of different vaccines. And some of those are going to be the traditional ones because many of the ones that are being tested right now are not the hyped ones you hear about from investors right now, but they are tried and true approaches that we already see with our childhood vaccines. So every way that you can try to make a vaccine, and there are about 8 or 9 different ways, there are teams working on all of those ways, and we don't know which ones yet will make it. I will say that one of the reasons I think it'll be a little longer is that we have to remember when you're receiving a vaccine, you're a healthy person receiving intervention. So the safety threshold is much, much, much higher. You have to be extra sure it's safe, which means you're going to need trials with 30 to 40 to 50,000 people in the final stage in the phase 3 trials to ensure that if there is an extremely rare adverse event, you can pick it up. You people who have volunteered for the trial that you can discover those. And I think that's a really important consideration, and it's going to take time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, President Trump has called the federal vaccine effort Operation Warp Speed. Is that a problem?
I have mixed feelings on that. I laughed when I saw it. The first thing I thought of for your constituents who are in their 40s or older was ludicrous speed from Spaceballs. I just kind of laughed when I saw it. I don't think it is a big deal. I think it shows that I know that given the history of President Trump's language, I think he means that in a serious way. That tells me that I think he's taking the vaccine effort seriously. So it doesn't bother me so much, but I don't want the public to think that that means we're going to have a vaccine next year. We might produce the fastest vaccine in history for this pandemic, for COVID-19. But if we do that, it would be 3 years and 11 months, and it would still be the fastest vaccine in history because the record so far is 4 years. Mm-hmm. So I think warp speed has what is warp speed to a cheetah versus warp speed to a snail? I mean, everything is relative. Mm-hmm. So in vaccine world, 3.5 years would be warp speed, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, certainly I remind people that we need to do the safety and efficacy studies, and those take time. There's no way to compress the time frame for many of them. And we certainly are not going to have a vaccine approved unless it's proven to be safe and effective. But despite that, and despite the fact we don't have any approved vaccines, the anti-vaccine extremists are already attacking the a non-existent coronavirus vaccine and saying that it's dangerous, it doesn't work, trying to undermine trust. What do you think is the impact of vaccine disinformation on acceptance of the coronavirus vaccine, where we've had polls showing that 20%, 30%, I think one poll showed 50% of people said that they weren't sure whether they would actually accept a coronavirus vaccine?
I think it's dangerous because it's trying to set up the messaging ahead of time. And I will give an example. My own dad, who was in the military and has received all of his vaccines and supports vaccines, and my sister and I were fully vaccinated, said that if there was a coronavirus vaccine, he doesn't think he would get it because he thinks there'd be a microchip in it. And I explained that that was false information. I explained where that false information came from anti-vaccine groups that are trying to promote misinformation. And then he said, well, then I'll wait until you get it, and then I'll get it. And I said, okay, that's a deal. And I think, honestly, that's how a lot of people are approaching it. And I don't think that's illogical. I think if you're an average person, it is normal and appropriate to be anxious or skeptical about a brand new thing that you would inject into your body or sniff, or inhale or take orally. I think that that's reasonable. You're going to want to see the safety data. And so I also think that the polls that are being done right now are not helpful. In fact, I think that they're counterproductive because I don't think it's a bad thing for 40% of people to say, I'm not sure if I'd want to take that vaccine or not when they haven't seen any data on it. I think they'd want to wait and see the data. And I think what we'll find is that when we do have that vaccine, the people who have greater confidence in the public health system will be the first ones to line up. And we can't have everybody get it all at once anyway. So the first ones will line up. We'll see that the vaccine is indeed safe because it wouldn't have made it that far if it wasn't safe. And I think the people who were on the fence or anxious about it will then say, oh, okay, my neighbor got it, my boss got it, my daughter got it, my friend got it. Okay, I feel good about this now. I'll go and get it. And I think we will see more uptake once people have that confidence. And I think it's completely normal and appropriate that they wait until they see the data or the proof in the pudding, as it will. That said, I think the polls and the misinformation ahead of time work against that because vaccination very much relies on public norms and the idea that everybody agrees that this is, or everybody who looks at the science agrees that this is a good idea. So by putting those out there, I think it reinforces this idea of, we should be suspicious. And I don't think those polls are useful. I think they don't have – I think their information is pretty much meaningless right now, and I think they're counterproductive. But I also think that the messaging that the vaccine won't be safe is also counterproductive and unhelpful. So I would say to everybody, all your listeners, put it on the back fence. Don't worry about whether you will or won't get the vaccine when it's out. Just put it on the back burner. Wait until the vaccine's here. Look at the evidence then and make your decision. And don't make a decision one way or the other right now because, you will feel more comfortable saying, I'm going to look at it when it comes out. I have faith that the public health community has made sure that this is safe, and then I'll deal with it. And I think we'll see a lot more uptake than people are saying that they will have right now.
No, that's a good point. As I said, we don't have a vaccine yet, so there's no
exactly.
data on it, and certainly I'm sure that it won't be approved unless there's solid safety data behind it. And
they're not going to give them to 8 billion people without knowing that they're not going to be hurting a lot of people in the process.
Right. Now, talking about the anti-vaccine extremists, interesting enough, there is no vaccine. So they've still decided to line themselves with white supremacists and gun extremists to organize protests against stay-at-home so we could spread the disease more, to oppose masks and contact tracing and practically any other public health intervention to stop the spread of this disease. One question, though, is that as a reporter, how do you report about these movements and protests, right? So they, on one hand, it seems to be a small group of individuals, but they're very vocal, who are out there, and it certainly can seem newsworthy, but at the same time, are we giving them too much attention and stature by reporting their activities? So how do we strike the balance about these anti-vaccine extremists who are very good at trying to get attention?
When I'm teaching journalism, I used to teach high school and college journalism, we teach the news values, and those are the things that we use to determine whether something's a story and how much prominence it gets in our publication. Examples of news values are timeliness, if it's happening right now, impact, how much of an impact it has on people, prominence, who's involved, if there's famous people involved, even oddity or human interest involved, proximity, how close the action is to you versus to other people that are not close to you. So I think as journalists, we internalize those news values, and that's what we're thinking about when we're deciding how to cover it. And when you have a protest, that's a protest in your area, there is definitely proximity and timeliness there. But I have to assess how much of an impact is this making. If it has a potential impact on transmission in your area, then that is what I need to cover, because that's what's relevant. And I can mention what they're protesting, but I need to focus on what the actual impact is. And the impact is, an increased risk of public health concerns, an increased risk of transmission of COVID-19. I also have to make sure that when I do things, a lot of people think that journalism is always about telling both sides of an issue. Mm-hmm. And that's not actually what journalism is about. Journalism is about doing as much background reporting as you can and talking to as many people as you can to get all of the relevant, supported perspectives of a story. Sometimes that means there's 5 sides. Sometimes that means there's 1 side. Sometimes it means there's 3 sides. And not all of those sides are created equal. They have different amounts of evidence behind them. And I need to weight my story according to where that evidence falls at the time that I write the story. So that's what I'm focusing on when I'm covering those groups. And I think it's worth mentioning that each of the groups that you mentioned are themselves the source of public health problems. Anti-vaccination extremists are the source of pockets of low vaccination that have led to outbreaks of measles and pertussis. Gun control extremists, as opposed to people who, want to hunt and have maybe a gun at home for protection that's safely locked up away from everything. Those people are promoting an idea that is promoting gun violence, which is a public health problem. Then you have the people who are, what was the third group you mentioned?
White supremacists.
White supremacists. White supremacist racism is a public health problem. It's the source of so many, health disparities. So it's interesting that all these groups that are each the source of public health problems have banded together. And I think that tells you how much attention we should give them. We should give them attention as public health problems. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who's protesting the lockdown is a public health problem. If people want to protest the lockdowns, and they can do that safely, not walking around with an AR-15 around them, but wearing a mask, socially distancing, holding up a sign, standing outside where it's open, that, protest is an American tradition, and I think that it's fine for them to do that, but they need to be not endangering public health as they do it.
Oh, that's a great comment to end on, as we're trying to be sure that people, again, get accurate information. We're trying to contain this disease. So I want to thank you so much, Tara, for joining me today and for sharing your insights. And I also want to thank our listeners for listening to this episode of Putting the Public into Health by Dr. Richard Pan. If you have questions or ideas for a future podcast, please email them to senator.pan@senate.ca.gov. Please stay at home as much as possible. Stay at least 6 feet away from others outside, wash your hands frequently, and try not to touch your face. Together, we are slowing the spread of disease and saving lives. Thank you so much for listening.